Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to be looking now at A History of the 20th Century by Martin Gilbert. It's the concise edition. You can see it's here. You can get it on Amazon. It's probably going to be also at your library. Look, it is on the FSOT recommended reading list, and originally it was 3 volumes. I think it was like 2,000 pages long or something. This is a pretty intense book, but I'm going to try to run through the highlights with you. So we're going to start with 1900 and 1909. Basically, I mean, it's a global history, so it's looking at everything. I mean, you're going to get all this stuff, some stuff that you don't want to know, some stuff that, you know, maybe you've never heard of or come across, but it is nice to. 1909, basically, it's marked by internal strife. Workers want to end autocracy, okay, or the rule by one. That's what autocracy means. Stalin rises, and his name means the man of steel. He was a Georgian by descent after 5 years of studying to be a priest. Now, because working conditions were bad, a lot of people dying or getting injured in, say, like machines. There's no safety mechanisms. There's no, the mines. It's just a lot of manual labor. And it really gave a big rise to why people thought communism was going to be a great answer to the capitalistic problems. So the mention that begins, there's Vladimir Ulanov, is most commonly known by as just Lenin. So he left Russia in 1900 after being exiled to Serbia for 3 years. He's then, put in Switzerland. So he's in exile, he's in Switzerland, and he basically built a centralized party structure. He determined to see a day when the Tsarist Empire would be no more. So Russia at that time in 1900 actually held Finland, what's modern day Finland, and was able to keep the Russian language, the official language, even though so few people spoke it as their native tongue. So the red flag was the revolution that we see, and it's like the student protests that were occurring in St. Petersburg. Lenin writes from his exile in Switzerland, and he says this day marks the beginning of an open revolutionary movement in the Caucasus. And actually, Joseph Stalin was among the student protesters there in St. Petersburg that day. Now, Leo Tolstoy was a Russian writer, and he was very popular. He was actually also an active supporter of the student protest in Moscow. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, probably in both cities. Because of his support, he was excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church. And he claimed that many religious Russians were being ruined and were in prison or banished for their beliefs. So then the Russification of Finland, it continues, with Finns serving in the Russian military involuntarily. The U.S. under Theodore Roosevelt would not help the Boers, so the Boer Wars in South Africa. There was violence against workers. Joseph Stalin was in jail for 18 months, and then 3 years he was in Siberia, right, where we'd think the cold exile, working in those labor camps. But he actually escaped. And the book says that the conditions that Stalin experienced in exile were much less severe than he would go on to treat other people in the future. So, yeah, I mean, Stalin was pretty famous for the heavy hand, for, it was bad, it was bad. So a political party that had a small beginning took the name of Bolshevik, which means the majorities. There was uprisings and riots were often put on the scapegoats, which were the Jewish people. Now, Serbia, the country. 1903, King Alexander and King Draga of Serbia were murdered in their palace in Belgrade, and their naked, mutilated bodies were thrown from the palace window. This was in response to the restrictions of freedom of the press and other matters related to voting, including the suspension of the Constitution. Okay, 1903, Serbia. Moving over to South Africa, there's the Boer Wars. So at that time, the British, they held 2 areas, and native groups held 2 other areas. Basically, the British win, but it cost them 22,000 soldiers to win that war. In 1906, the Zulus, a people group, protest violently against the British. Also remembered Gandhi is imprisoned in South Africa for 2 months with hard labor. So oppression of Indians coming to South Africa was pretty common. So we see this. Moving over to Germany, there was a determination to suppress Danish minorities in some areas. Basically, the Germans bought tracts of land and encouraged German people to move into those areas. So it's kind of reminiscent of the what we see the Jewish or the Israeli people doing with their encampments or their in that area in order to kind of take more lands. They also admit women into the university system for the first time between 1900 and 1909. Now, in China, you have the Boxer Rebellion, the famous Boxer Rebellion. And the meaning of the Boxer was righteous, harmonious fists. Basically, all foreigners were suspect of anti-Chinese sentiments, and there was a lot of violence, especially amongst Christians, Christian missionaries, or converts to Christianity. So, there were some protected areas for like foreigners to kind of go to, safe areas, you could say, but all in all, pretty brutal. In Britain, the Labour Party becomes popular as industrial work leads many workers to speak up for their rights. So there's especially a high level of brutality in the camps, in the like work camps, or in South Africa with the Boer Wars, with prisoners who are taken captive. The British, they protect Kuwait from the Turkish invasion. So some historians, or you might see this as a test question, who else would come to the aid of the Kuwaitis? President Bush and the first Bush would send American troops, right, to protect the Kuwaitis against the Iraqis. So continually exerting their strength, the British were. They take economic control of Tibet. They're collecting taxes. In Britain, you have the suffrage movement for women to be able to vote. They needed to maintain the control of the Suez Canal, and the British saw Egypt as a colonial success story. What about Austria-Hungary? So there was an internal vision in the Habsburg Empire, the Habsburgs being the ruling elite in Austria and Hungary. In fact, I think at one point, Franz Joseph, it says, ruled both nations. So that's pretty interesting. I don't know if that's ever occurred. I don't think it ever occurred in that century. But anyway, in the Habsburg Empire, you have a lot of ethnic mixing, and this caused a lot of the problems. You have the Germans, you have the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Ruthenines, the Poles, Hungarians, the Romanians, the Serbs, the Croats, the Italians. There's just a lot of people. Some were Christian, some were Catholic, some were Muslim. And so it says basically the Serb-Croat conflict erupted in 1902. Newspaper articles insulted the Croats, who then attacked the Serbian properties like the banks and whatnot in retaliation. Martial law was declared. The Croats were Catholics and the Serbs were Greek Orthodox. Well, so what's going on in the Middle East? Well, in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, you have civil war with non-Turks and non-Muslims. There's problems. Austria and Russia have instructions to Turkey called the Merzsteg program. There are reforms in Macedonia that were needed. They were essential, and that's what some of these programs were pushing for. The Turkish government complied eventually. They didn't want outside pressures or people telling them what to do, but eventually they complied. Race and religion were no longer a barrier to official employment in the government or otherwise. However, the Hungarians did not take their own advice when dealing with the Croat problems. So they continued to kind of use some racism in dealing with people. The Young Turks overthrew the Sultan in Constantinople. So if you've seen that YouTube channel, that's kind of the history of where it goes back to. So Hong Kong, you have the bubonic plague. In India, you have another famine. Actually, we're going to see a lot of famines in India. It says that this is not at all uncommon for India at the time. And of course, you have Gandhi. In America, you have President William McKinley. He was shot and killed by another American. During McKinley's presidency, the U.S. had acquired the Philippines from Spain by war, and he had, quote-unquote, effective control over Cuba. He was succeeded by Theodore Roosevelt. They fought a guerrilla war in the Philippines. Also, oil is discovered in Texas. There's mass production of the motor car. Of course, you have Ford, right? William Ford? You have Ford Motor Industry. And U.S. Steel becomes the first billion-dollar company in the world. So, good time for them. I think that was Carnegie? Don't quote me on that. But anyway, U.S. Steel is huge. Puerto Rico was acquired in 1898. There's large changes through immigration. Also, there's the rise of the Rotary Clubs, which were basically philanthropic groups for business professionals, people trying to give back to the community, back to society, but doing it in a way that, kind of suited their interests as well. Henry Ford, this is his name, Henry Ford. So the automobile becomes an integral part of society. Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle, and it's basically a novel about the conditions of the stockyards and meat packing houses in Chicago. Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Acts were passed through Congress. Before that time, you had a lot of people getting sick. There was no controls, there's no regulations, and so government needed to step in. The Antiquities Act under Roosevelt set aside federal lands for the protection of objects of scientific, prehistoric, or historic interest, and he also had the National Forest Commission. So Coca-Cola replaces the cocaine with just caffeine in their sodas. New York Film Studio and also the radio stations changed America. In 1908, you have the Model T, and the cinema is becoming a popular American pastime. So in Panama, remember you have the Panama Canal, that important passage, trade passage through there. It says it declares independence from Colombia. The Americans were previously told that they could not build a canal under the Colombian rule. After independence, the promise of payments and military protection from the Colombians made the deal go through, and they went ahead and they built the canal, the Panama Canal. The Americans were given a 10-mile wide strip of land for which they could exercise all rights and sovereignty. So in Belgium, the Belgian Congo under King Leopold. France, it had dominance in Morocco, recognized by the British. Whereas the French in turn recognized the dominance of the British in Egypt. So as they were kind of competing colonial powers, they did recognize, hey, look, you kind of have, the French, okay, you guys are well established in Morocco, we respect that. The French in turn turned to the English and they said, look, you guys have your successful colony in Egypt, we respect that. And so they kind of like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of relationship when it came to their colonies. Portugal had 300 years of colonization in Angola in Africa. So that's an interesting point, right? There's, I think, more Portuguese-speaking people today, even in Angola, than there are in Portugal. And I think the same is true for Brazil. So interesting how the colonial efforts kind of shape things as we see them today. So Japan has a naval war with Russia. Again, we're talking about 1900 to 1909, so that first decade. So there was a ceasefire that was officiated through President Roosevelt, and Port Arthur was ceded to Japan. Now, Japan dominated Korea. It imposed its own imperial rule in Taiwan, a Japanese possession since 1895. Expeditions again against the Aboriginal populations of the island in 1906 resulted in the killing of tens of thousands. So maybe like 60,000 people or more. They said that the exact number is a controversy, but this is something that hasn't been forgotten. The issues with Japan and Taiwan are very strong, very emotional, as well as with China and Taiwan. So just something to think about. Inventions. So important inventions during this decade. In America, you had the revolver. Okay, in Germany, you had the airship, right? The Zeppelin, right? The British, they come up with a submarine, very important military discovery or invention. Also dynamite, so a chemical to have high explosive power. Could you imagine a world where dynamite didn't exist? You could imagine a road building, tunnel building, any kind of mining without dynamite. That's huge. Also, malaria was identified. So now instead of this mysterious sickness that people get for some reason that no one understands, now someone's finally cracked the code. And that's a huge, just to be able to identify that how is it caused, how is it spread, where does it come from, that's big. French scientists see that radium can help in the fight against cancer, and Kitty Hawk Wright brothers are the first to fly the airplane. So pretty cool. So in Egypt, the British ruler promulgated a law placing under police supervision and village confinement anyone who agitated against British rule. So you see the heavy hand of the colonialist powers, this time it's occurring in Egypt, but honestly, it's a repetitive theme that we see over and over and over again. The British had no plans of leaving Egypt, as the Suez Canal was an imperial necessity. So again, we see these canals are pretty huge. The British were claiming superiority and therefore right to rule, as they were able to stabilize the death rates of infants through mosquito control in Egypt. So kind of cool thing there, but you could see that they wanted the Suez Canal in return for those good deeds. The Moors attacked the Spanish in Morocco. The Moors were defeated eventually despite causing serious trouble, and militant Islam was again repressed according to the Spanish. In Germany, women were admitted to university for the first time in 1909. We just talked about that. Some of the important innovations the department store, the first Jewish collective farm, or the kibbutz. Most were Russian Jews who did this form of agriculture in Palestine. And 20 million people a week go to the cinema. Wow. Can you imagine the influence, ideological influence, the norms, the ability for that industry to influence people? Huge. People reach new heights in aviation. So I guess it's not just skimming over the hills. Now we're really getting some altitude under those wings. Chapter 2, 1910 to 1914. So, okay, this is just because in World War I starts in 1914, they just chop it up like that. So in Russia, you have the Tsar, the Russification of Finland and Poland, limiting the rights of self-government. There's restrictions on Jewish residents and higher education. So Leo Tolstoy dies in November of 1910, and he was opposed to capital punishment. Now again, in Turkey, going back there, the Young Turks were nationalistic. Turkish forces lose to Italian forces in Libya. Interesting if you didn't know that historical piece about Libya. Italian involvement there. Albanians seek full autonomy. Now Austria-Hungary, I mean, this is really the start of what kicks off World War I, is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So basically he meets with the German Kaiser, and he asks for support to end the strengths of the Serbs. It says, quote, basically the Serbs were the source of the anti-Austrian feelings in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They believed that the Russians would not intervene. Despite being warned, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife went to Sarajevo anyway. And Sarajevo is it's the capital of Serbia. I'm pretty sure, yeah. So quick correction, Sarajevo is actually in Bosnia-Herzegovina, not the capital of Serbia. So you can see on the map, Sarajevo is in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And they were shot and killed by a student. Now the Austrian plan with the Germans, they believe that the Serbs can be punished without others being brought into conflict. So they really wanted, they wanted someone to pay. But the Austrians claimed that the Serbian government planned the assassination. Of course, the Serbian government denying this. The Austrians make an ultimatum for war, which centered around the policing of anti-Austrian propaganda within Serbia. So they were trying to really squash this, whatever people were upset about in Serbia, they were trying to get them to shut up, right? They wanted people to be in favor of Austria. They wanted to be well supported and well liked. Obviously, I mean, they're reeling a bit, right? Their Archduke, their leader, their main leader, was just killed. So it's a big problem. So the British hoped that it would not go to war. And in Germany's opinion, the Kaiser said that war was not needed and that he thought it was unwarranted. Austria, nevertheless, declares war on Serbia, right? It's like, I don't know if it was for pride or if they just felt like enough was enough or whatever, but Austrians decided to go to war. Now, France refuses to commit to taking a neutral stance. And the Russian Tsar tries to persuade the German Kaiser to do everything in his power to persuade the Austrians to go light, to just take it easy. But the Kaiser maintained he had already used and was using all the influence he had in that regard. So they were trying to get the Austrians to settle down, right? Take it easy. We understand there's assassination, okay? I know it's a big problem, but just don't do this, right? I mean, people were trying to use whatever leverage they could. But Germany declares war on France and demands passage through Belgium in order to attack France. So Belgium denies this permission to the Germans. The attack on Belgium would give Britain some quote-unquote rights to fight against the German forces according to an 1830 treaty. Basically, all right, all hell breaks loose. All right, so Macedonia, it's where the Greeks and the Bulgarians refused to give up their firearms. France protected Fez, in Morocco, city in Fez, from Berber invasion. The use of force to stop protests by workers, and this is another continued, whenever there's riots or labor strikes, we're going to see a lot of corporations or governments using force in order to stop protests, in order to force people to go back to work, in order to, accept low wages or unsafe working conditions or high taxes or whatever the thing is. It's just, the 20th century was pretty brutal. Conflicts with Germany, so France has conflict with Germany and the German Navy outside of Morocco. There's an airplane accident that injured or killed some important French leaders of the German government, and this really rushed the call to make airline regulations. So airline was an interesting, technology. I'm sure they wanted to monetize it. They want to make it profitable. They want to use it for trade and all the benefits, of course, that we enjoy today. But I mean, when you see people dying, the thing was they knew that this was a problem, much like in America, where people were well aware of the data about automobile deaths, all the people that were dying by car accidents. Yet it took a long time for the government to really push and say, you know what, we need to regulate this, we need to step in, and we need to make this thing more safe. Airmail begins in India, so that's good. Albania. What's going on in Albania? Looks like they take independence. I didn't catch from who, but immediately, Serbia invaded Albania, striking the Adriatic coastline. And Serbia's actions angered, again, Austria-Hungary, as if that wasn't already an issue. In Britain, you have dock workers striking. You have the strikes, the worker strikes in Liverpool, in Manchester, and in London. Moving on. So Russia dealt with confrontational university students by placing police at the universities and forcing military service upon unruly students. So you get kicked out of school, oh great, now you have to go serve in the military. Doesn't matter, just that's what they decided to do. Social welfare programs were becoming popular to support the many workers who were injured during their labor or who were ill for long periods due to workforce hazards. Now, Lenin organizes a meeting with the Bolshevik Central Committee. Lenin nominates two people to help him, and one of those was Joseph Stalin. So violence continues to be used against workers. I mean, obviously, the Industrial Revolution, it was dangerous, it was profitable, it was important, but governments didn't seem like they really knew how to handle the disgruntled workers, besides using force. In Libya, was only part of North Africa that was not controlled by European powers. So I guess they did. So I thought that they were controlled by the Italians, but it looks like by this point they've somehow thrown the Italians off and managed to get some level of independence. It says the Turks had governed Libya for a few hundred years, but now the Italians were trying to enforce their will. In 1910, the Italians won their war for Libya. The interior Arabs of Libya fought with the Italians, and the book says that there were terrible atrocities done to each other. In the United States, there is a lynching in Pennsylvania when a black man who had tried to commit suicide to avoid arrest for theft was taken from his hospital bed, dragged out, and burnt alive. And I said, well, what in the what? The juries refused to convict. Also, the Titanic sinks. It was a voyage from Southampton to New York. Woodrow Wilson is successful in disarming the Muslims in the Philippines. In South Africa, there was segregation and discrimination. A few random notes at the end of chapter 2. In 1911, the revolt on Espiritu Santo, one of the islands of the New Hebrides, was put down. We see just a lot of colonies or colonized people revolting. South Pole is reached. We have the first person who is not killed in an attempt to be a parachuter, so now we have that technology. The cinema becomes very, very popular, and Charlie Chaplin is the star. So